Today we are going to talk about the CW show Superman and Lois. We already have 2 seasons of Superman and Lois, and season 3 is going to start airing on March 14th. Granted, this show is a CW DC show. However, it's been established that it's not actually part of the Arrowverse, which in our opinion is a good thing because we tried the other Arrowverse shows and they just didn't work for us. But Superman and Lois did. We're actually looking forward to the new season. In this video, we are going to discuss the pilot for Superman and Lois. So, season 1, episode 1.
What I like to look at this series as, to explain to people what I mean by it's not a CW superhero show, is I make the comparison of this is like the Mandalorian of DC superhero shows. Because although technically it was made and put on the CW, it doesn't have any of that CW, I'm going to call it silliness, where you have these group of young people that are teaming up to help the superhero, and it's more about personal whatevers than actually doing something of use. So I just want to explain that we appreciate the CW shows were distasteful for a lot of people. We actually tried all of them. But I also appreciate, because we had in the comments when we brought this up before, there's people that watch this with family and it was just kind of a bonding experience. I'm not trying to disrespect those people, but we're also trying to explain that we get the stigma of the CW shows and why somebody would not want to try this. We're looking to review season 3. Our hope is season 3 continues down the same path. We don't know. There has been ownership change at DC as well as Warner Brothers. So season 3, with all these other CW shows that were ended, I don't know if we're going to start seeing an influx of that CW stuff into this iteration of this DC universe. I hope not. So we are cautiously saying we're going to review season 3, hoping that it stays the same as season 1 and 2, but we won't know that until we get into it. But I just wanted to explain the stigma. We understand the CW stigma, but we actually think, I think especially because this first episode, it really, to me, encompasses what the series is about. And this is probably the best episode of the series, is the first episode. That's why we want to review this one, to try to get people, if they want to try to jump into season 3, to kind of get them into what the series is about.
Superman and Lois are parents in this iteration of 2 teenage boys. So this was more of a family show. So it had to appeal to both people around our age, but also young people as well. So I think that because of the different demographic it was going after, it had to be a slightly different show from what they were doing with the Arrowverse. And obviously for us that worked. And we really liked Superman and Lois, so we're hoping that season 3 carries through with what we were seeing already.
What this series does, and this episode does, is it shows Superman in 3 different lights. It shows Clark as the superhero, it shows Clark as a husband, and it shows Clark as a father. And they do a really great job of mixing all that together, so you really get to see Clark / Kal-El from all 3 angles, and it's fascinating to watch.
Yeah, they did a fantastic job. In the beginning of the very first episode, it starts out with Clark as an infant landing in the Kent cornfield. And it goes from there to showing different scenes from his childhood, like when his father passed away. We finally end up starting the actual story when Clark and Lois's newspaper that they're working for in Metropolis, the Daily Planet, has been purchased by a billionaire. This billionaire being Morgan Edge. Unfortunately, Clark and Lois walk into the office one day. They are in the process of laying people off, and one of the people who gets laid off was Clark Kent. Lois was retained. So that was a very interesting way to start the show, with Clark Kent losing his job. He's also having problems at home because he is very often absent. His kids don't know why, because they have not been told that their father is Superman. So one of their sons has social anxiety disorder and is in therapy and on medication. The other son is a football star. So their family life there's a lot of tension already there. And then just as Clark has been laid off, he receives a phone call that his mother is dying. So that's really where the show starts out, is with Clark Kent's life in utter chaos and him just trying to figure out how to bring balance to everything that he has to deal with on a daily basis. Next, we see them at the family farm for Martha Kent's funeral. At the funeral, there are some interesting conversations that take place between Lana and her husband, Kyle, and Clark and Lois. It's all about how their hometown, Smallville, is basically dying, and how many people have been forced to move away, how many farms have been foreclosed upon, people selling. It was good to see something that I felt actually reflected the American experience of small town America. It was interesting to hear Kyle's perspective on that versus Lois Lane's big city thoughts on what she was seeing. The interesting thing about this scene was that they were both right. Unfortunately, though, the person that Kyle thought was going to be the savior of the town, the guy who was retrofitting the local mine and putting people back to work, he was bringing jobs. Lois knew that this guy wasn't really a good person because he was the one who had just bought the Daily Planet and laid off all those people. So she knew that something rotten was going on there.
What I found interesting about that conversation, because they were at the kitchen table talking, is you could divvy up Kyle's perspective and Lois's perspective into the political spectrums that we're dealing with now in real life. Kyle made a comment about there used to be a time where you would live in a small town, you would go off to college, and then you would take that knowledge and bring it back to your community and share back with the community, and that's not happening anymore. I appreciate where he was coming from because I saw that happening in real life. I think all of us have seen this happening in real life. Throughout the beginning of the first episode, you saw all these for sale signs in front of people's houses.
And foreclosures.
I thought this first episode, unfortunately, they kind of strayed away as the season went on, but this first episode really hit home to me what was going on in, I'm going to be very United States centric here because I'm living in the United States. I grew up as an American here, but that's how I grew up here, where I just saw all this changing, and I see it happening now, even more so. We're pretending that nothing is going on, or this is just part of natural change. And those conversations that Kyle was having with Lois at the table, I've been around people talking like that, except they weren't nearly as civil as that. There were people yelling back and forth across the table. And this was nice to see a civil discourse of these topics in a way where they could be explored. It's kind of funny because our channel is very Star Trek centric. That's what Star Trek in the old days used to do, was present material like that in allegory and then allow the viewer to decide which way was correct. And I thought that kitchen table moment was like kind of a Star Trek-y moment where they were setting up how the world works, and Kyle saying, well, this person's bringing jobs and it's going to revitalize this community that I grew up with. And then Lois Lane saying, well, that guy's not bringing jobs, he's just going to take advantage of Smallville and that's it. And you could absolutely see where they were both correct in what they were talking about.
Yeah, Kyle was very offended by what Lois said because the implication was, well, you think I'm an idiot. There was a certain arrogance in what she was saying. However, she was correct that Morgan Edge guy wasn't there to do good things. But at the same time, the way that she was speaking to Kyle, the way that she was implying that you don't know what's going on, the arrogance of it, it was a good learning moment, I think, for her, and I'm hoping for a lot of people.
She noticed in the conversation when Kyle pointed out and said, you think I'm stupid, you could see in the facial expression that the actress gave that her character was supposed to realize that she overstepped what she said and she was thinking about what she just said.
Yeah, that brings up a larger conversation. I don't know if we should continue with the episode now or if we should just talk about this conversation.
Why don't we finish the episode, and then at the end there we can bring up, because I know we have larger issues we want to talk about related to this episode. Why don't we finish the synopsis, and then we'll, like we usually do, we'll do our analysis at the end of it and get into the topics on why we really liked how this was starting.
Okay, so anyway, Clark and Lois's sons, Jordan and Jonathan, are outside talking to one of Lana's daughters. Her name is Sarah. The kids were talking like teenagers, and it was brought up that the Wi-Fi on the farm was really spotty. It turns out that the router was in the barn. Jonathan and Jordan are like, oh, we're not supposed to go in the barn. Dad told us not to. Jonathan says, yeah, but that was like back when we were 8 years old. So the three teenagers go over to the barn to reset the router. Jordan takes the ladder up into, I guess, what is supposed to be the hayloft to reset the router. For some reason, there are a bunch of pipes that have been stacked up there. In order to reach the router, he has to really lean from the ladder, and he put his foot on these pipes to steady himself while he reaches the router. And he does manage to reset it, but unfortunately, at the same time, the pipes give way, he loses his footing, and he falls on the ground. And just as the pipes are about to fall on top of him, his brother Jonathan jumps in and tries to save him. And the next thing we see, the pipes are covering both boys. Clark comes out. He starts just whipping these pipes off of his son. Fortunately, nobody else was in the barn to see this, but he didn't even pretend to be Clark at this point. He was just pulling the pipes off of his sons.
He was chucking them, like he was taking these heavy pipes and just chucking them across the room because he was so scared for his sons' lives.
Yeah. As it turns out, both sons have mild concussions, but otherwise they're fine. The paramedics are just telling him, how lucky they are. Jordan's not buying it. He's like, isn't this weird that this happened and we're not even really hurt? And his brother Jonathan is just like, forget about it. But Jordan couldn't do that. So while their parents were at the bank talking to Lana about the future of the farm, the boys go out to the barn with a crowbar and they break the lock that they find on a trapdoor in the floor. And they go down into the basement of the barn and discover Clark's spaceship that brought him to Earth as a baby. They are obviously and very reasonably very freaked out by this. Once their father returns home, they demand answers from their parents. And so at this point in time, Clark is forced to confess that yes, he has been lying to them. He tells them the truth. They are angry because they've been lied to their entire lives, which makes perfect sense. So to go back a little bit to what was going on with Lois and Clark while the boys were investigating the barn, they were at the bank talking to Lana. She works at a bank. As it turns out, Martha had taken out a reverse mortgage on the farm, and she was using that money to help people in Smallville.
In one situation, she was explaining, Lana, that Martha was helping out a neighbor who had medical bills that she couldn't pay off, and it was causing problems. Other people were trying to keep their homes. So again, it ties back to what we were saying earlier about the relevancy of what they were setting up at the beginning of this series.
Yeah, so Clark and Lois are given the option. They can either sell what was remaining of the farm to the bank, or they can take over a mortgage to pay back what Martha had already borrowed and keep the farm. So that's when they returned home and the boys confronted them. Obviously that didn't go well. At that point, Clark gets called away because somebody is attacking yet another nuclear facility. While Clark is gone, Jordan decides he's going to go to this party. Jonathan figures out where Jordan has gone and follows him there. And at the party, unfortunately, Jordan, he was bonding with Sarah over the fact that both of them are on some sort of anxiety medication, and he kissed her. That's when he found out that Sarah had a boyfriend when her big boyfriend comes over to kick his ass. Of course, Jonathan steps in to defend his brother, and that's when the fight ensues. That's when Jordan loses control, it becomes obvious that he's the one who saved himself and his brother in the barn because he discharges laser vision into the fire and causes an explosion at the party. Meanwhile, Clark is fighting this individual who's been sabotaging the nuclear facilities. He was on the bad end of a fight with that guy. That guy seemed to know everything about him, intimated that he was from a world where Superman had destroyed everything. He took a piece of kryptonite and drove it right into Clark's chest. And as he was falling to the ground, that's when Lois activated the, homing device to let Superman know that he was needed. You could see his life flashing before his eyes. He was thinking about his family. I think it was Lois activating that device that actually snapped him out of it.
That scene mirrored very well with earlier in the episode when he got a call from the doctor and then he rushed to Smallville when his mother was dying. And then later on he says, well, as I was flying to my mother as she was dying, I heard her whisper something, which was to come home. And then when Lois called for Clark to help when she saw on the television set that there was an explosion at this quarry thing that I think she knew the boys were there. That's why she was panic, or it said local teen hangout, I think, in the thing. But when she flipped the homing thing, she said, Clark, help, come. She didn't say come home, but she's like, Clark, I need your help. That mirrored so well between what Martha asked at the beginning when she was dying, except that thing she whispered had more meaning than just right now, come home. And then what Lois was doing. I thought that mirrored very well at the beginning and end of the episode that both times, he was being summoned to a place where he wasn't necessarily needed as Superman. He was needed as Clark Kent somewhere. At least that's how I interpreted those two scenes.
Yeah. So he pulls the kryptonite from his chest and he goes home, and it's Clark that we see walking past the ambulances and the fire trucks at the quarry where the kids were having their party, looking for his sons. It's at that point that it's realized that it was Jordan who has the powers, not Jonathan. It's after this revelation when Lois and Clark are trying to figure out what they're supposed to do next that Clark floats the idea that instead of selling the farm, that they take over the mortgage and they move to Smallville. And after discussing this, Lois decides, you know what? That's actually probably the best thing we can do for our family. So they tell the boys that they have something that they need to discuss with them, tell them that they are considering moving to Smallville permanently, and that in a few hours' time, they were going to have a discussion as a family to decide what they were going to do. And at the end of the episode, we see the guy who had attacked Superman going into his spaceship high in the mountains with a whole bunch of snow. And the ship refers to him as Captain Luthor. So we are led to believe at this point in time that that was Lex Luthor who had attacked Superman. And that was pretty much where the episode ended. Clark was going to take Jordan outside to show him how to do something, and he was like, ooh, does this have to do with my powers? And Clark's like, no, I'm going to show you how to hitch a plow to a tractor. And that was actually a really fun moment. It was such a nice family moment that they shared there at the end of the episode with the family heading outside to figure out how to plow the fields, which was obviously something Clark knew how to do because he grew up on the farm. But his sons, this is completely foreign to them. So that was a really fun end to this episode. I thought this episode had a lot of really good stuff in it, and it touched on a lot of things that I wish all of them had carried through the rest of the season and through season 2 as well. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff is going to get lost, and we're going to talk about that stuff right now. The stuff that we thought was important that I wish they would have held on to more.
One of the things that I think needs to be stated up front here, if somebody hasn't seen this, is your sister mentioned this because she walked in one day when we were watching this and she looked at the screen just quickly. She only watched like 10 seconds. She knew we were watching because he was wearing a Superman outfit, but she said something like, "That's Superman? Shouldn't he be bigger?" That's where the conversation kind of kicked in, where Henry Cavill, he's built to be Superman. I understand why people want that to be Superman. If I can imagine somebody looking like Superman other than Christopher Reeves, it would be Henry Cavill. and he's built like him. He's just kind of stocky and muscular. And the gentleman that's playing this, is it Tyler?
I believe it's Hoagland.
He has, I was trying to explain this to Molly earlier. It's like he has a swimmer physique. Yeah. So it's not like he's not built, but he's definitely not like power lifter looking. And so that's the first thing one has to get used to when one sees the series, is the actor that they have playing Superman. He's not exactly that physique that you would expect, but he makes up for it with the way he plays Clark. And I think that's why this works for me, because it's not like he's horrible as Superman. He's pretty decent as Superman. But this series is very much based around Clark Kent. Because, in my opinion, that's what Superman is he's Clark Kent. He's just Clark Kent who has other abilities that they don't know he's Clark Kent.
Well, yeah, because let's face it, Clark Kent is who Superman really is. That's who Martha and Jonathan Kent raised, was Clark. And Superman was the
alter ego, I guess.
Yeah, I guess he was the secret identity, really.
People they've explained this to many people, and I agree with it. Whereas with Bruce Wayne and Batman, the real person in that situation is Batman, and Bruce Wayne is the alter ego. But with Superman's the alter ego, and Clark Kent is the real person.
Yeah, because they talk about in this episode, it was actually Lana, when she was telling Lois and Clark about the reverse mortgage that Martha had taken out, that Martha was like that town's Superman, that if anybody was in trouble and needed help, they could go to her. It's implied that Superman is the kind, helpful person that he is because of how he was raised by Martha Kent.
I know this is a hot spot with a lot of people, but to me, that's why I had trouble with the Henry Cavill portrayal of Superman, Man of Steel, is it seemed like he was searching in that movie for a reason to not only unhide himself. Why do I want to defend these people? In this series, it seems like they're doubling down on Clark doesn't need to find a reason to be Earth's champion. He was raised as an Earthling. He grew up with his friends around him. Lana, he talked about Lana when he was younger, and Kyle was even mentioning about, you walked away too and didn't come back, but you haven't visited in a while. So Clark doesn't need to find a reason to fight for people on Earth, to be their champion, because he's one of them. At least he identifies as one of them. And that's why Man of Steel just didn't work for me, because it just seemed like he was spending a lot of his time as I'm the alien and I have to figure out why I'm going to double down with these Earthlings. Whereas in this TV show, it's all about Clark being raised as a human being.
Yeah.
He acknowledges he has it's basically an adopted son story, because it is. He's not pretending he's the natural son of Martha and Jonathan Kent, but he was raised by them. His values were by them. Smallville, Kansas, that's why he's the good person that he is because his parents raised him with those Midwestern values. And to me, again, I'm probably going back to me being an old man and being raised in the United States. But that's the thing I've missed for so long that I love about this series, is the nuclear family, and that how important family is. This family had issues, and as the series goes on, they have issues like families do, but they're a family. They're an old school family where they go up and down, but they're a family. And even when I mentioned about Martha whispering as she was dying for Clark to come home, it wasn't like she was whispering for him to hurry up and save her, because she was dying. She knew she was dying. That was the end of it. But what she was saying that Clark finally figured out is she was saying, bring your family back to Smallville. Bring yourself back to Smallville. This is who you are. And in that big city, you're getting lost. And they showed at the beginning of the episode how all in Metropolis, there was all this hustle and bustle. And the family was just kind of each doing their own separate thing. They weren't actually working as a family. And I think Martha knew that, and she wanted to bring the family home and Clark home, because Smallville to her was who Clark was. That's all she's ever known Clark as her son in Smallville. That's what that message was. And I thought that was a really strong message that played out through the whole episode. And I thought it was really well done.
Yeah, because the last time he'd actually spoken to his mother, he was talking about how he wanted to prioritize his family, how he was worried about Jordan. Yeah, I think that was her answer, come home. And it becomes increasingly obvious throughout this season and the next that not only did Clark need Smallville, but Smallville needed Clark as well. That's something that now I guess would be a good time to start talking about what we think of that conversation that took place at the kitchen table between Lois and Kyle, that yeah, Smallville did need Clark Kent. It didn't need Superman. It needed Clark Kent. I'm not really sure where to go from here with this, because what I want to say is that I am tired of everything except the coasts being treated as flyover.
Yeah, you and I talked about this during the rewatch of the episode we did a little bit before recording this. I know that I fit into what Kyle was saying. I wasn't from a town as small as Smallville, but it was a relatively small town. And I went downstate to get my college education. And then I moved away somewhere else. Why? For two reasons. One is the economy in my local town was falling apart. There wasn't any opportunity when I was a young man to do anything. And two is the medicine in the area, because it was falling apart, was just really bad. I fit into what Kyle was saying. You're supposed to get your fancy degree and then come back and share it back with the town. That resonated with me when he said that, because I understand where he's coming from with that. I saw my hometown completely disintegrate when I moved away, not just because of me, but lots of people like me did that. And then my hometown, which is not in those coastal areas, I grew up in flyover area. I really appreciated what Kyle was saying. Molly grew up in a town very similar to Smallville as far as size.
Oh, yeah. Very similar. And very similar as far as, because you see at the beginning of the episode with all of those foreclosure signs and for sale signs on all these farms. And that's what happened to the town where I grew up. And even if you want to go home, there's no home left to go to. And I am so fed up with the people who are supposed to represent our interests doing absolutely nothing to help us.
So that helps one understand Kyle's point of view, where if help's not going to come from the government, at least this billionaire is offering to create jobs in this area, this decimated little town.
And he tricked them into buying into it. He exploited them, because what options did they have?
So I think both Molly and I, we resonated with that conversation at that table, and I thought it was really well done.
Yeah, and I could understand where Lois was coming from, because she knew this guy was a shyster, that he was just exploiting these people for his own ends. Unfortunately, the way that she spoke to Kyle, instead of sharing information about, yeah, I know this guy, he may seem like what he's doing is helpful, but let me tell you what he did over here. No, instead she came off as very elitist. She treated him like he was stupid or something. Fortunately, he called her out on that. It's a shame that it turns out she was right. But if she had presented her information in a different way, it's entirely possible that Kyle wouldn't have rejected it. And it was all about how she delivered it. She didn't have to be so condescending when she did. I think she learned a lesson from that, because a lot of times people, they don't call you out on your BS when you're behaving like an elitist jerk, especially when you're, having a face-to-face conversation. Oftentimes people will just be like, yeah, whatever, and just walk away and then do whatever they were going to do anyway. And it just goes to show how important it is to discuss these things with some compassion. Because when you've got a small town that has been decimated by the loss of jobs, the loss of their farms, the loss of income, you need to actually do something to help. Because unfortunately, a lot of time, just wagging your finger at somebody, oh, well, you should have seen this coming. You should have gotten a different degree. You should learn to code, because that's going to help. Go back to school, get retrained. Well, that's all well and good, but a lot of that stuff takes money. If you have just lost everything, how are you supposed to do any of that?
To me, not only in this episode, but in both seasons, because I'm going to admit, the arcs that they had in both seasons, parts I liked and some stuff I didn't like, that's not the strength of this series. The strength of this series is what we were talking about a little bit ago. In this episode in particular, not only was there the kitchen table dialogue, you had Clark questioning whether he was letting his sons down as a father. In fact, he apologized to Jordan for not being around. This was after Jordan was told that he was Superman, actually shown he was Superman. And that whole scene when he showed them that he was Superman, those kids were angry. They believed he was Superman then, but they were angry because they were angry at their father for hiding stuff from them and for not being there. There was this nice quiet scene where they were on the back porch. Jordan was sitting there by himself, and Clark walked up and sat down next to him and talked about how when his father, Jonathan, found him in the cornfield, and magically he was a father by just finding him. Being a father is hard, and he acknowledged to Jordan that he hasn't been there for him, and he said, "You're right, I haven't been there for you, and all I can offer is I'm going to try to do better." And then there was another scene where Clark was staring off at the back of their house, and it was just him and Lois, and he was staring at the horizon going, "Am I a bad father, Lois?" And then Lois was trying to explain to him reasons why being a parent is hard. There's no instruction book for it. You just have to do the best you can. Something like, it may not be a super thing, but it is a human thing. And again, that ties into Clark Kent doesn't need a reason to be the champion. He grew up as a human. He has human failings. There was this other nice little scene where Lois and Clark were on this porch, the front porch, and Lois was staring off going, "Man, when we got married and looked toward the future, we didn't imagine lost jobs and children with anxiety disorders." And she was going on a bit of a list. She said something similar like, "We just have to do the best we can." That's another thing. Lois, through this entire series, this is what a strong woman used to be written as. This show is such a throwback series. She doesn't need to grab a machine gun and mow people down and behave like some sort of roided up male 1980s action star. Lois is strong because of her character. Because back at that kitchen scene, she realized she made a mistake and that she overstepped her authority, and she figured out that she made a mistake. She's offering all this good advice to Clark about dealing with life. There were these little moments between the characters, and this happens for 2 seasons because, as I said, when the arcs are iffy, you're always getting these good scenes with the family. And going back to what I was saying before, I grew up believing in the American nuclear family and believing in you work hard and you take care of your community and you take care of your friends, and that's what life is about. Over the past 25, 30 years, it seems like that American dream has been ripped away, and I don't know what America is anymore. It was so nice because this is Superman explaining through Clark how the American dream is supposed to work. He acknowledges it's not perfect. We're looking around. This isn't right. That's what was so profound to me, is through the writers, through Superman, with Clark talking, because he wasn't in costume at that point, he was mentioning that this isn't the American dream. I mean, he didn't say those words, but that's essentially what him and Lois were talking about. That resonated. The first few episodes of season 1, it teetered on saying some super profound things about the world we live in. Unfortunately, then it started turning into more of a superhero-y thing. Even going through this series, it has moments that are good. Because I had somebody else explain to me how Superman works in general, because I'm not a big comic book reader. I just know Superman from the Christopher Reeves movie, the animated series. I've watched some of the old George Reeves stuff, but that's where I know Superman from. But this person explained to me, like in the comics, I guess, again, somebody correct me if I was mistold, but Superman, a lot of times, he'll take this tremendous beating when he first meets somebody because he's so afraid of hurting them, because he doesn't know how strong he is, or he doesn't know exactly what his strength will do to somebody. So he'll take a tremendous beating because he's basically invulnerable, so he can take it until he figures out the amount of force needed to take down an enemy. Through this series, you see that, where he'll initially take this tremendous beating, but then he'll figure out the amount of strength needed to take somebody out. Again, if I was told correctly, but that's certainly how I'm reading it, that Clark is still a human being that was raised in the Midwest. These values of take care of your neighbor and don't hurt people, it just reinforces that, because there were several moments where he actually felt compassion for the person he was fighting, and he didn't want to hurt them, so he sat there and took the beating first. This series is just, if you don't like the arc of the story, the character moments, I have not seen the like on television in a long time, of dealing with the American family and what the American family wants, where we are falling short and giving the American people the tools they need to have the dream that they want. And yeah, I really do wish there was this Superman, not Henry Cavill Superman, I'll tell you that, this Superman to be around to try to get things straightened out. There was, again, I know we're not talking about the rest of the series yet, but you have Superman calling out a general because the general was upset that, like, you know, he helped out these non-Americans. He saved them instead of taking care of things the way America wants them done. And Superman was like, yeah, I don't do that. People are in trouble. I don't care what nationality they are. I'm just going to help them. Because that's another theme too, is he's almost to a fault in this series. He believes his job is to save every single person. And this goes back to what we've been talking about with Star Trek, where they are killing massive amounts of people and human lives mean nothing to them. But in this series, Clark is upset if one person dies. This series warms my heart when I watch it. Star Trek used to warm my heart, old Star Trek, but my heart's been dead ever since the JJ stuff. But this series warms up pieces in me because it connects with me. It connects with human beings. It's all about human beings connecting with each other. That's why this series works for me. And the fact that the first episode was touching on a lot of things that American culture is dealing with right now, I don't know how more people don't know about this series. I understand the CW tainted this brand, but you're missing out on something really good if you don't at least try this series. I mean, we're going to go through the reviews of season 3, and we're going to hope that it doesn't go down the crapper, because lots of ownership has changed. But the first 2 seasons, there are moments, human moments in these episodes, in every single episode, even if the arc fails at times, to give you a human connection with things. And it's really, really well done. This episode 1 represents this series, basically, because I think this first episode is the best of the entire series, because it gives you a good indicator of what the rest of the series is going to be about. That's why I would recommend, if you only watch one episode, you're like, look, I don't know about this. I watched the CW stuff, don't like it. I'm superhero burnt out. I don't really like superheroes anymore. All I'm suggesting is it's like a 45, 50 minute watch. Just watch episode 1, season 1. It's on HBO Max if you're in the United States. I don't know where you'd find it anywhere else. And just watch the one episode and see what it has to offer as far as human connection moments. You might appreciate the reviews we're going to do in season 3 if they follow through with this.
Yeah, because this version of Superman is the Boy Scout. That's what we've been lacking in so many versions of Superman lately.
It's the Christopher Reeves Superman. That's what this is.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not imitating Christopher Reeves, but that sort of Superman.
The Boy Scout.
That's what this is.
Yeah, because Clark was raised to understand that with his superpowers came super responsibility. He understood that he had a responsibility to use the tools that he had to do what he could do that other people couldn't. It's so refreshing to see a decent version of Superman again.
And we've talked about this before, too, because they add the new piece of him being a father. It's nice to see a father, a male role model. He's offering advice to his sons. He admits he wasn't there before, and he makes a good effort to be there whenever they need him. Jordan needs him more than ever because now he's going down that path of, I've got these new abilities, and what am I supposed to do? And Clark can remember when he was dealing with those same issues, and they actually touch on those conversations. Clark has several conversations guiding Jordan on how to deal with his abilities, also saying stuff like, I get angry too, but if I don't keep my anger in check, people can get really hurt and people can get scared of me, and I gotta every moment keep myself in check. And we had a video where we talked about that's the exact opposite of what they did in She-Hulk.
Because it was a very similar situation.
Bruce was trying to give her that advice, but she didn't want to listen at all.
Yeah, because all it takes is him losing control once, and no one will ever trust him again. For some reason, Jen can lose control, and that's fine because somebody provoked her. Oh, goodness gracious. Now, I really preferred the way that they handled things in Superman and Lois, because the wisdom that Clark is imparting to his sons is just so much better than the messaging that we have gotten in so many other shows, especially something like She-Hulk, where you can really map 1-to-1. Here's somebody who came into powers, just like Jordan did. But unlike Jordan, Jen, well, she's not gonna listen to her cousin, Bruce Banner, even though he's been dealing with this shit for decades. No, she was just too arrogant to listen. It was so nice to have those family moments where people are working together and caring about each other and just behaving like I think real human beings would behave, decent human beings. I'm so fed up with, yeah, like you said, shows like Star Trek now, where human life seems to be meaningless. Well, life in general, because I guess not all those lives are human, but that's beside the point. They don't deal with any kind of philosophical issues anymore as to what is the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do. How do you tell the difference? I'm so hoping that season 3 continues with what we've seen already, with Superman and Lois, because I'll be very disappointed if they change the formula of the show.
Superman in the Superman and Lois, it's a bit of a spoiler, but I think it's important to know. I won't mention names. There are at least two enemies I can think of who were enemies at first that Superman actually made friends with later in the series.
Yeah.
He's all about trying to understand somebody's point of view. He still has to protect people, but at the same time, he wants to listen and see how he can help you. He even wants to help people that have been trying to hurt him before.
Yep.
There's so much good in this series. I understand if you got burnt by the CW, Batwoman, and some of those other lovely ones. This is completely different. For what it's worth knowing, HBO sunk a bunch of money into this. The same people that are funding The Last of Us, they're funding this now too. Or they were anyway. Yes, it aired on the CW, but this was an HBO project that they funded money into. It's filmed differently. It doesn't look like it's on an iPhone and people are wearing role-playing costumes that you'd see at like a costume party. The costumes look good. The themes are adult-like in most cases. Like, yes, there is a high school piece to this where the kids are dealing with high school issues, but even then they tie them into larger philosophical issues about hiding things, keeping secrets, things like that. This is good family entertainment. You can sit down with your entire family and watch this and somebody gets something good out of it, and it is pushing good messages.
So, did anybody else out there watch Superman and Lois, or were we the only ones? What were your thoughts on the pilot versus the rest of the series so far? Did you see the same things that we did? Did you see something that we didn't talk about? What are your thoughts on that? So please leave those in the comments below.
Take care.